Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me once again for another functional medicine inspired webinar. We are going to be discussing hormone assessment today. There will be sort of two test panels that will be involved in this conversation, the salivary hormones and urinary hormone metabolites. And these, both of these tests fall solidly within the perform at home in terms of functional medicine specialty testing. So they very much fit and are in keeping with this idea of uh, furthering any functional medicine progress that you may be interested in pursuing while COVID-19 persists and we're all being asked to stay at home and practice good social physical distancing to decrease the spread of this viral pandemic. As usual, financial disclosure, it's important to know I'm using these tests because I value the insights that they provide, not because I have any sort of beneficial interest in doing so. Let's also do a bit of an update on the COVID-19 situation. Confirmed cases continue to go up throughout the world. That is to be expected, to my mind. But you know, it's very good to see that the confirmed fatality rate continues to decline, a little bit of a greater decline over the past week than, say, the previous couple of weeks. So that's very encouraging to see. And as we've talked about, this idea of confirmed versus suspected, we're probably looking at something significantly lower than this 6.2% really. That in actuality, probably far, far more people have already come into contact with this virus and may just not have realized it because it was an asymptomatic experience. I wanted to just touch back in as well with this idea of the use of certain malaria medications to prevent or treat COVID-19. This sort of came very much to the foreground last week when President Trump mentioned that he was taking hydroxychloroquine as a preventative measure under the care of his physician, and it sparked quite a significant outcry from any number of healthcare practitioners throughout the country. There's been a new study just published in The Lancet in the past week, which really looks very specifically at these malaria drugs in alone or in connection with a certain class of antibiotics, and really found that not only were they not helpful, they actually were increasing of a different type of risk. So this was a study that was just published online on the 22nd. It was a multinational registry analysis. So this is an observational study as opposed to anything that was prospective, randomized, double-blind in its setup. So the authors, in addition to releasing all of their results, were also somewhat quick to say, you know, it'd be great if we could get some prospective studies on this as well. Thus far, as we'll see, the results are not supportive of using these medications in any situation other than some sort of hospital-based clinical trial for now. So we had 671 hospitals. This was on 6 different continents, over 96,000 patients. There were 4 different treatment groups, each of the 2 malaria drugs in question alone, and then each of them with a macrolide, which is one of these particular classes of antibiotics. So almost 15,000 total patients in the treatment groups, and then the control group, which did not receive any of these medications, was a little over 81,000 patients. The outcomes that the authors were interested in investigating were overall mortality while still in the hospital, as well as the development of a new abnormal heart rhythm in that particular individual. Anybody who already had a previous documented heart rhythm. That's not what they were considering. Really, the development of a new such heart rhythm that was abnormal. The mortality results were displayed. They're displayed here. Definitely greater in each of the treatment groups. And the arrhythmia results also each greater in all of the treatment groups relative to the control group. And the conclusion that the authors came up with was that this really shouldn't be used outside of that particular setting, as I mentioned. It should be in hospital, and it should be as part of a study group, or these really shouldn't be considered. It's just too much risk to, based on the information that we have currently, to consider using these in an outpatient, preventative, or treatment fashion. Okay, so let's move on to the testing that we are here to discuss today. We'll start with the salivary hormone testing. There are several different providers that are offering this. The one that I typically use is Genova Diagnostics. Depending upon what levels are being checked, at the absolute lowest end of the spectrum with insurance participating, and that means that there's a medical necessity for ordering this test, there would be $49 out of pocket to the patient. At the higher end of the spectrum, if we're doing a more comprehensive sort of look at these hormones in certain individuals where it's going to be done over a longer period of time, and let's say insurance was not going to be participating for one reason or another, you'd be looking at somewhere between $300 and $400 probably for this sort of panel of tests. Doctors Data also offers one. I believe there's a couple of other providers out there, but again, I typically use Genova, and you're going to be seeing examples from their test reporting to illustrate the points I'm trying to make. Now, these are typically done as multi-spot collections over varying periods of time. By that, I mean you're going to be collecting several different saliva samples at different specifically designated times on certain specifically designated days. At the easier end of the spectrum, it's just going to be basically one collection, one time, one day. At the harder end of the spectrum, it would be over an entire, say, 28-day period with typically just one collection per day on some of those days, and then towards the end, it's going to be multiple collections over a single day. We're usually looking at somewhere between 1 and 3 milliliters of saliva, which doesn't sound like a lot. For some people, that can be a little bit challenging. So if you have a hard time producing saliva just naturally, this test may be a little bit more challenging for you to undertake. Moreover, there's a 5-minute time limit during which the saliva needs to be collected. So if that is a problem, then it may be difficult to get an adequate sample in order to be able to generate accurate and useful results. As I said earlier, most of the values are done just once daily. Several of them are done as a multi-point assessment over the course of one day. In men, testosterone is handled in that fashion. Cortisol for anyone who's doing a multi-point cortisol curve assessment, and melatonin as well, which is a hormone that is promoting of sleep and should be higher at nighttime when we are hopefully sleeping. This chart is by and large really the territory that we are going to be discussing today. This is a group of compounds in the body that are known as steroidogenic hormones. You can see in the top left that the main feedstock for all of these hormones and byproducts is cholesterol. Now this ties in with what I was speaking about 2 weeks ago in my advanced lipid testing webinar, saying that cholesterol is not inherently bad. It is not to be reduced at all costs. We need cholesterol for various important roles in the body, one of which is to be the precursor, the building block for all of these hormones in the fashion that's laid out here in this schematic. Now, when we're doing a salivary hormone assessment, these are the various hormones that we can check. Now, there's also melatonin, as I mentioned earlier. That's not one of the steroidogenic hormones. That is produced in the pineal gland in the brain, but its availability and how it's functioning does have an indirect relationship to how this whole steroidogenic unfolding of different hormones in appropriate or not appropriate amounts plays out. So that's why that level is also included on the salivary hormone assessment. As I said earlier, we're going to also be getting cortisol as a multi-point curve as part of this undertaking. And what that will typically look like is something like this, where you'll, when things are working well, tend to have higher cortisol first thing in the morning. That's just part of the diurnal rhythm that we as a species seem to practice. So the sun comes up, it's time to get up. Cortisol, a stress hormone, is going to be elevated when things are working well so that we can have the energy and the motivation to get up and get on with our new day. As the day progresses, those levels will, when things are working well, naturally decline. And by bedtime, ideally, it will be at its lowest so that we will be primed and ready to be able to undertake a restorative sleep process. When things are not going well because of extreme stress that is unrelenting, cortisol can actually end up looking like this. Now, this is a pretty extreme example of that. It doesn't have to be straight across all the way at the top. It can be anything that's really outside of that green region, which is sort of within one standard deviation of the norm. And this individual, this is made up though, is clearly dealing with a lot of stress. And what happens under such circumstances where cortisol remains abnormally elevated, particularly over the course of the whole day, is that the feedstock hormones coming in from cholesterol start to pull more and more towards the production of cortisol. And what that does is it elevates this overall amount of cortisol circulating in the body. It's a phenomenon that's often referred to as cortisol steal syndrome, because when this happens, there is less of the feedstock hormone available for DHEA and the reproductive hormones. And what ends up happening is that DHEA goes down, testosterone goes down, and the estrogens all go down as a result. And that can produce any number of different clinical pictures that can be very problematic for the individual dealing with them. Now, if this situation persists for long enough, essentially what happens is that the brain steps in, so to speak, and says, enough, I can't deal with all of this cortisol circulating all the time. And the brain starts to downregulate the adrenal glands, and we end up with what's commonly referred to as adrenal fatigue. And it's not so much the adrenal glands themselves burn out or no longer are able to function. It's really, again, that the brain is telling the adrenals to knock it off already because it's too much for the brain to take. But in so doing, we continue to have reduced amounts of all of the other very important hormones that are also assessed on this salivary testing. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we do also get a melatonin curve, and that looks a little bit like this. That does entail getting a salivary collection in the middle of the night for my sharp-eyed viewers between 2:30 and 3:30 in the morning. That's a one-off inconvenience that does yield some very useful insights. If sleep is an issue, whether too much sleep or not enough sleep, and that is a result of too much melatonin or not enough melatonin, getting that data point can be very helpful for getting to the bottom of that issue for the patient. We'll also get testosterone as a curve in male patients who are undertaking this testing. And that will look a little something like this. Testosterone ideally should be higher in the morning and decline a little bit over the course of the day, kind of like cortisol, so to speak. For females who are premenopausal, the cyclicality of the reproductive hormones is very, very important. And as a result, such individuals are best served by undertaking a 28-day collection process. And again, it's not every single day, but it is one point on 11 of these days. And you can see essentially for this sample individual, those points laid out. And again, the darker region in the middle, 1 standard deviation, the lighter region outside of that middle, 2 standard deviations, and then anything beyond that would be beyond 2 standard deviations. So this can be very, very helpful for getting to the bottom of various female reproductive system challenges, complaints, pathologies that may not have been fully recognized or might benefit from some further interventions. Getting this whole cycle mapping of where the various hormone levels have been on different days can often enough provide the missing piece of information needed to be able to start to bring some improvement. For females who are postmenopausal, there's not going to be that same degree of cyclicality. So we really typically just get sort of a one-off assessment. Now we will get not just the estradiol reading, we'll also get estrone and estriol, all of the 3 different types of estrogens, plus testosterone, plus progesterone, and then the comparison of progesterone to the estradiol. So that is really helpful when we're considering making use of bioidentical hormone replacement therapy. This sort of baseline reading, or if the woman is already on BHRT, checking in to make sure that dosages are appropriate is a great way to guide such treatment. Now, one very important hormone, pregnenolone in the top left, is not able to be assessed by way of salivary hormone analysis. So usually I will get that as an add-on blood test, and that can be done at any area lab facility, Quest, LabCorp, hospitals, what have you. And it is also possible to get these hormones as well, progesterone, DHEA, testosterone, estradiol, if the individual is interested in using bioidentical hormones but doesn't want to undertake the salivary collection, maybe can't produce enough saliva, maybe doesn't want to collect multiple samples over the specific time period. So this is another option. It is able to be worked with. It provides insight into levels of the hormones that are actually circulating in the bloodstream, but not so much levels of hormones that are available in the tissues to the various cells and organs and so forth that the hormones are interacting with. That's really where the benefit of the salivary assessment comes in. You're able to get a clearer sense of how much of a given hormone is available to the tissues to stimulate the response that that hormone stimulates. It's also possible to get one other reading known as a sex hormone binding globulin, which really is just present in the blood. It would not be able to be assessed via the saliva. If we are going to be doing a blood test to check hormones, I will definitely get that as well. We don't need to get too into the weeds with why, but suffice it to say that that will be an additional one that I would add on to the order for blood work. Now, let's move along to the urinary hormone metabolite testing. There's various providers here. I tend to use Physicians Lab more with this one. Genova does offer a panel of their own along these lines. I've found that Physicians Lab is a little bit more comprehensive and the cost is a little bit more reasonable. There is a guaranteed out-of-pocket expense of $99, and then Physicians Lab will do everything that they can to um, get the remainder of the payment from the patient's insurance. Now, it is possible that that won't be able to happen for whatever reason, in which case the expense of the test will go up. In my experience, it's been they've been very successful at getting that. So it's usually around a $99 test. And I think you'll see as we get into it that there is quite a lot of information that's available from it. It's typically undertaken as a 5-time collection over 2 days. Sort of day one, you wake up, there's that first time you need to go urinate, you urinate without collecting it, and then there are 4 more collections over the course of that day. And then on day 2, you get up and it's that first morning urination that needs to be collected as the 5th collection. Now, it is possible to do pared down versions of this test. They would result in fewer values for the various markers that we're going to be discussing. If so, that would usually be done as, say, just the first morning void collection. But generally, I recommend the 5-time collection because of the more comprehensive nature that the more comprehensive insight that it provides into how the body is handling metabolizing all these different hormones. It's just a couple of milliliters of urine collected at a time, then needs to be sort of pipetted up and put into test tubes, and then that gets sent to the company and they process it. For postmenopausal females and all males, these collections can happen anytime. For premenopausal females, the timing is very important because, as we saw earlier on the cyclicality of estrogens and progesterone, there will be varying levels according to a normalized sense of how a woman's hormonal cycles unfold. So generally, we encourage the start of the collection around 20 days or so following the commencement of the most recent period. Now, what this testing will look at is listed out here: testosterone and all of its various metabolites, estrogens and metabolites. We can't get an actual read on progesterone, but we do get the progesterone metabolites. We get DHEA and DHEAS, and we get a lot of the stress hormone metabolites as well. So again, this chart of the steroidogenic pathways, and we saw earlier that basically these were the values that were available to us, whether through salivary hormone assessment or through the serum hormone assessment. When we add in the urinary hormone metabolites, we are able to get all of these values as well. Now, there is a little bit of overlap between the two. That being said, we can't use urinary hormone metabolite testing to basically dose bioidentical hormones. It's for various reasons that we don't need to get into. We simply just can't use it. It's not a reliable indicator of hormone need and basically how those hormones, once they've begun to be used, are affecting levels. So this is really for a far different purpose, which we're going to be discussing here in more detail in just a second. You can think about all of these different values as being roughly broken up into about 5 different major groups. First, there's basically these stress hormones and stress hormone metabolites. There's also DHEA, which plays in very noticeably. It's largely produced in the adrenal gland, so that's right where a lot of this cortisol is being produced. So ties in very closely, but DHEA also ties in very significantly with basically the male reproductive hormones, testosterone and androgens, and all of the metabolites of those hormones. It's basically the primary feedstock leading into androstenedione, which then becomes a lot of the metabolites. But DHEA also takes sort of a side channel over to the androstenediol, which then becomes testosterone. DHEA is the most abundant hormone by mass in the body. So we do want to have adequate amounts of it, which is why we're able to check it in basically each of these different ways. It's really critical to be able to get a sense of what those levels are in an individual who's having a hormonally based complaint or medical challenge. And we'll move on from here to the progesterone metabolites. And then the last major group is, of course, the estrogens and the estrogen metabolites. And you can see the DHEA, is only really one step removed from estrone. So it is also very, very important for females who are having various hormonal complaints. Now, we could talk about each of these different groups and why the urinary hormone metabolites is helpful why it's helpful to have that information when considering, whether it's reproductive or whether it's stress or whether it's just DHEA. But we simply don't have enough time to do that. And I think that this estrogen territory is a little bit more easily understandable. And what I would suggest is we just sort of focus our conversation on that. But know that this same type of depth of information, the same type of insight that is able to be gleaned from these metabolites and hormone levels applies to really all of these different areas. So let's break out the estrogen metabolism section and we'll go a little bit deeper here. So generally what we're looking at are the three different estrogens: estrone, E1, estradiol, E2, and estriol, E3, in red. But we also have their metabolites, largely the estrone metabolites, in red as well. Now in blue, we have the various enzymes that help to facilitate the conversion of one molecule into the next over the course of this biochemical chain of relationships. If you happened to attend my organic acids webinar several weeks ago, these next couple of slides will look a little familiar. If you didn't and you have interest to do so, please know that all of my webinars are being added to my website, pvosteo.com. You can go there, look in the audio video page of that website, and you can watch any of the past webinars there. Enzymes, by and large, as we discussed a couple of weeks ago, do one of two things. They either break chemical bonds or they form chemical bonds. And really, you can think of this as these bonds would break or form on their own, but the enzymes are really helping to speed up how quickly these changes are occurring. It can really happen on the order of a million times or more increase in speed. Now, there are other, nuanced ways of saying that, but by and large, these are the two functions that they help to serve: break bonds, form bonds. When we talked about this on the organic acids testing webinar, we were speaking about the organic acids test as basically similar to an automobile emissions test. You can see in the top portion of this image here that molecule A is converted into molecule B by way of enzyme AB, so on and so forth, down to molecule D at the end. On the bottom, if there is a problem with this processing, conversion of one to the next, and that's typically because of an issue with an enzyme, then we end up with an over-accumulation of a given product. And that, as depicted in this image, is product A, but it could be any of them depending on where the issue was. And the issue can be due to nutritional deficiencies. It can be due to genetic variations. These are sometimes referred to as SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms. It's synonymous with a mutation or a genetic variation. Or it can be because of dysbiosis. And again, we talked about all of these different factors in much greater detail in that organic acids testing webinar. So let's go back to estrogen metabolism. If we think about estrone, E1, and what the body is going to do with it as it is produced, carries out its messenger functionality in the body, and then needs to be gotten rid of. There are three different possibilities outside of being converted into estradiol, E2. One, as one of my functional medicine instructors referred to it, is referred to as the good, the 2-hydroxyestrone. The other is called the bad, the 16-alpha hydroxyestrone. And the last is called the ugly, the 4-hydroxyestrone. Now let's talk about the good. Why is it considered the good? Well, it does have some weak estrogen-like activity. So, that's fine. The body can deal with that and make use of it, and hopefully it won't be too impactful in what it does. However, if there are concurrent exposures to various toxic substances, this can potentially become problematic if it goes on for long enough and if levels are sufficiently high. The bad is often referred to as the bad because it has much stronger estrogen-like activity. We can just see that intuitively because what does it get turned into next? One of the other types of estrogens, estriol. Now, estriol, or E3 as we sometimes call it, is definitely the weakest of the three different estrogens, but it's still an estrogen and it still has an action. We can also take note that this ratio of the 2-hydroxyestrone to the 16-alpha hydroxyestrone seems to be a pretty good approximation of the ratios of these metabolites that are present in breast tissue. There's some thinking along the lines of how useful this could be prognostically for the likelihood of developing breast cancer. Ideally, we would want to favor that 1A1 pathway leading to the 2-hydroxyestrone, the so-called good, because that would yield a higher 2:16 ratio, and that would be considered to be more favorable from a breast cancer risk perspective. Now, there's also the ugly, and it gets that moniker because it is procarcinogenic, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And higher levels of it do seem to lower that overall 2:16 ratio we were just talking about. Now, is that because more of the estrone is being pulled down the 1B1 pathway? And as a result, there's less available to the 1A1 pathway and that reduces it? Or is there something else going on with the presence of the 4-hydroxyestrone that leads to a reduction in that 2:16 ratio? Not particularly clear, but there is a relationship that we've noticed. Ideally, when things are working well, the overall amounts of the 4-hydroxyestrone would be minimized by the subsequent activity of the COMT enzyme. And that would result in production of this 4-methoxyestrone, which is much more readily excretable in the urine, and therefore gets rid of this potential for a problem with enough accumulation and enough time. Now, in terms of the various enzymes, this step 1, we sometimes refer to it as phase 1 detoxification, is really made up of these cytochrome P450 enzymes. Now, these are very famous within the medical world. Cytochrome P450, it's a huge family of many, many different enzymes. And the 1A1, as we've been talking about, helps to turn estrone into the 2-hydroxyestrone. The 3A4 version of the cytochrome P450 enzyme converts estrone into the 16-alpha hydroxyestrone. It's also the enzyme used in the second step to convert the 16-alpha hydroxyestrone into estriol, or E3. And the 1B1 version of it helps to convert estrone into the 4-hydroxyestrone, the ugly version. The important thing to take note of is that genetic variations with these different enzymes results in increased activity. So if there is a SNP, a genetic variation, what that means is that that particular enzyme is going to become more active and do a much more successful job of turning estrone into whatever the various metabolite is that it produces. The second step, we sometimes call phase 2 detoxification, is handled by catechol O-methyltransferase, COMT, for the 2-hydroxy and the 4-hydroxy. The important thing to note here is that genetic variations with this enzyme cause decreased activity of the enzyme. And why is that important? Well, we can imagine a worst case scenario where the individual in question has a genetic variation with the cytochrome P450 1B1 enzyme, resulting in increased production of 4-hydroxyestrone. It's basically more successful and it's able to pull more of the estrone down that pathway. And in this same individual, this worst case scenario, they also happen to have a COMT genetic variation, which means that enzyme is significantly less active. So we end up with a bottleneck of sorts and an accumulation of the 4-hydroxyestrone. And as we mentioned a little bit earlier, this is a pro-carcinogenic substance. And basically what happens is it forms compounds that start to attach to DNA. And over time, and with enough of this chemical reactivity happening, the individual is at a much greater risk of developing cancer. So the value of that urinary hormone metabolite testing in that one example is we gain insight into how this individual's body is handling all of these biochemical transformations, much as we talked about with respect to the organic acids test a couple of weeks ago. But this is a more particular, specialized use case of the same sort of methodology. So in summary, we can think about these two different types of specialty tests with each with their own respective use cases. The salivary hormones are, again, a really great choice when it comes to considering whether or not it makes sense to use bioidentical hormone replacement therapy. They are also an excellent choice as we continue to monitor the use of such therapy in an individual to make sure that levels are really staying where we'd like them to be, not becoming too excessive, but also not inadequately replaced. So if the individual just hasn't gotten enough benefit from the therapy as initiated, rechecking these levels and finding that actually levels really aren't as high as we thought they would be can be a really good way to bring about some improvement. We are all individual expressions of human physiology. So just because one particular dosage for one person whose original testing came back in a certain narrow range, just because that worked well for that person does not necessarily guarantee that it will work just as well for the next person who tests similarly on initial assessment. Moreover, salivary hormones can be a really great choice in any woman who is dealing with some sort of female reproductive system complaint. Now that could be polycystic ovarian syndrome. It could be uterine fibroids. It could be irregular, heavy, painful menstrual periods. It could be early menopause. I mean, the list is really quite long. So getting this type of testing, particularly in a premenopausal woman, where hormone levels are fluctuating so much, is really very, very helpful. Especially when we consider that the alternative, a blood test, is typically just, it's kind of like taking a picture. It's a shot in the dark, and if the timing of when that blood draw is undertaken is not done so very judiciously, then the results of it, particularly if they aren't borne in mind when considering the results can be misleading or just simply not very helpful. Using the salivary hormone approach in a premenopausal woman is far more like taking a video. We get an extended view of where hormone levels have been over a whole menstrual cycle, really. Now, urinary hormone metabolite testing is also helpful for female reproductive system complaints, but from a different perspective. This is really, how is the body managing getting rid of these hormones once their job has been carried out? If the body is doing so successfully and optimally, usually things are going to be working much better than if it's not. And sometimes the answer to why am I feeling this way? Why am I struggling with this complaint? Whatever it may be, can be found by undertaking this testing and carefully analyzing the results that come back. This is also a really good idea for any individual who has a personal history or a family history of either breast or prostate cancer. What the science has shown us is that both breast cancer and prostate cancer have certain similarities, such that if you are, say, a man who has a first-degree relative, that is to say, a parent, a sibling, or a child with breast cancer, if it's a female, or prostate cancer, if it's a male, then you as that individual are at a greater risk of developing prostate cancer yourself. Similarly, if you are a female with a first-degree relative with breast or prostate cancer, you are at a greater risk of developing breast cancer yourself. So running this type of urinary assessment gives greater insight into how you and your physiology is managing getting rid of these hormones, and how well it's doing it. Is it doing it in the good way, the bad way, the ugly way, for example? And if so, what can be done to help support the physiology going through a more ideal pathway choice? That also kind of speaks to this idea of metabolic optimization. As we saw briefly, we didn't really get too deep into it. We do gain further insight into the stress hormones. We gain further insight into the androgens. So any sort of metabolic optimization that we think, we either suspect or we know from other testing would be beneficial, we can undertake this testing. And as is often a very reasonable suggestion, undertake a treatment and then in time repeat the testing to assess the effectiveness of that treatment that was chosen. So let's just wrap up here by going over the reality of my practice here at Pioneer Valley Osteopathy. Basically, I've been doing more and more of these telemedicine consultations, and as a result, I wanted to make available a complimentary supplement consultation to anyone, whether or not a patient. Anyone who is a patient can certainly avail themselves of this resource, or if there's something more specific that's not just pertaining directly to supplements, we could also do just a standard 30-minute follow-up consultation for such functional medicine needs as might pertain to you. Now that would be a paid consultation, the 30-minute one, but the 15-minute ones are complimentary. And individuals who are new patients who haven't yet established care with my practice can do either of those approaches. If they wanted to do the deeper dive that's a little bit more specific, not just about supplements, that would be done as a first half of the initial 1 hour long consultation. The complimentary 15-minute consults do also allow access to the full line of pharmaceutical grade supplements available through FullScript, an online supplement dispensary that I use with my patients. And I would also provide a 10% lifetime discount on everything carried by FullScript if you take advantage of this complimentary consult. What this would basically allow for would be a personalization of supplements that you might be interested in taking, might not know you would be interested in taking until you spoke with me, or as sort of a refinement of supplements that you are already taking but may not be what I would call the pharmaceutical grade. Now, pharmaceutical grade really is referring to a standardized dose that's been subjected to rigorous quality control without the addition of any extraneous fillers or additives, binders, things like that. And I have seen that this really can make a significant difference in effectiveness of these treatments, making use of supplements, whether just for general wellness and health promotion, prevention of chronic disease states over time, or because there's something specific that has emerged and that is seeking to be treated through the use of supplements. The reason I do like Fullscript, in addition to not needing to carry anything in my office, and in addition to now in the time of COVID-19 when we're really trying to minimize direct interaction, they carry a broad array of different brands and blends, all of which are pharmaceutical grade. They store them under optimal conditions. They are continuously turning over their products, so nothing is really going up to close past the date of expiration, and they are shipping these products to you under ideal conditions. The most common example I typically cite is probiotics, which often enough do need to be kept under chilled conditions in order to remain viable. The other key thing is that they have excellent customer service, such that if any unforeseen issues arise, you can get in touch with them and they will make it better. They're really fabulous in that respect. Once we are able to move through this COVID-19 reality, I'm looking forward very much to getting back to how things had been through the end of 2019. New and existing functional medicine consultations here in the office, new and existing osteopathic treatment appointments here in the office, although we are getting started with that on a very limited scale now for the past couple of weeks. If that is of interest to you, please reach out to the office and we can see what makes sense in terms of getting you on the schedule for an osteopathic treatment. And then, of course, anybody who's already established can continue to make use of the telemedicine consultations, the remote video conferencing. I will also continue to offer the complimentary supplement recommendations just because that has been a really nice feature to provide and to offer as a support mechanism for anyone who's interested. And lastly, I would just like to say thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This has really been a very enjoyable, great opportunity for me to remind myself of what I'd already known, but to just dig back through it and be able to present it in a way that is hopefully easily understandable. Not saying that there's going to be a test on any of this right now, but hopefully this has been easy to understand. And it's really been a great joy for me to be able to offer this as a resource to everyone now as we're all facing COVID-19. If there's anything that I can do, if there's anything that you need that you think I could be helpful with, please reach out. If you're a patient, you can message me through the portal. You can certainly pick up the phone and call or email. And just bear in mind the hours in which the office is open, and know that I'm so happy to help if there's anything that I can do. It doesn't look like there are any questions, so with that, I'm going to say thank you one last time and sign off, and stay safe and healthy out there. Okay, bye-bye.